Thank you everyone for coming. So basically we're going to talk about all the doom and gloom when it comes to data, both from a software development lifecycle perspective, but equally when a lot of our, depending on where you sit in the room, depending on like what your persona is and what you look after, we still use a lot of off-the-shelf software, and we put a lot of trust in those software vendors. So I'm going to talk about some of the scenarios, and ultimately we're going to be talking about backup, boring backup, but hopefully we're going to educate, raise awareness of some of the bad things that happen. First of all, a disclaimer. I'll simplify this. Basically, I am using an open source piece of software to highlight the bang and the bad thing that happens to your data. Hopefully I don't get sued for using that, but so there's a disclaimer there. The other thing is that this actually happens, right? Like default configurations are the easiest option when it comes to deploying workloads in the public cloud, on-prem, wherever you decide to run that. It's very easy to deploy using the default configurations, and I'm going to get into a bit of the reasoning why that shouldn't be your default way, and hopefully everyone in the room already knows that. But if we can help raise awareness of that, then hopefully we'll have a safer world and a safer place to store our data. So who am I? First of all, this was a session that actually I gave with a friend of mine called Anais at KubeCon 2024 in Paris. There's a longer version. There's a resource at the end of this. I'll share the slides. It's like an hour session, and we went into a bit more live demo and role playing around that, the bang, both left and right of bang, and I'll get into that. But so a big shout out to Anais. She helped build and curate this content. But equally, I'm Michael Cade. I'm a very fancy title, Globefield CTO. I'm a technologist. I come from the operations side, but actually I look after from a development perspective as well. So Veeam is a software company that provide backup tools out there. I'm not going to pitch Veeam. That's not important. We don't need to talk about that. It's just more of the premise of we need to invest in our and making sure that we back up our important data. So I work for Veeam. That's where we focus on all of that good stuff. Open source projects, though, I've been involved from a Kubernetes contribution point of view, but where it gets more fun is the projects that you create and that you help other people out there in the field. And I'll spend a couple of minutes just talking about these. So we've got Canister. It's the first little icon. Again, I'll share links to these. Canister is a way within Kubernetes, if you're running databases or data services within your Kubernetes cluster, or even you're leveraging AWS RDS, it gives us the ability to perform consistency when it comes to taking a backup and sending that to S3 or to a location profile. So open source project, donated to the CNCF Sandbox project. It's about looking after the databases that you run and making sure that they're consistent. The next one is Kubester. So this is about understanding the storage that you have within your Kubernetes cluster. If anyone's ever played with Kubernetes, especially in the cloud, like that Kubernetes storage and the difference between different hosts play a huge part in understanding what IOPS and performance you're going to get on that. Kubester simplifies that. Again, an open source project. Navigate is a way in which we can visualize Helm charts. Collect is a cloud-based inventory. You can see that I've been tinkering a lot. That's why that gopher's there, is that I'm an aspiring, I'm a geek at heart, but ultimately trying to learn Golang, and when I grow up, maybe I'll be able to make something great. And then that final logo, that 90 Days of DevOps, is 4 or 5 years ago, the new buzzword, or we went round the cycle again, and 90 Days of DevOps was a project that I created. It was about learning in public, and it was about sharing with the community some of those key areas, whether it be Linux, whether it be Golang, whether it be Kubernetes, containerization. And it's a project that is open. There's a GitHub repo. It's got 28,000 stars if you're into vanity metrics. But people see it, people use it to basically learn that fundamentals of what DevOps is. And it's been going for a couple of years. Anyway, that's enough about this. Let's get into the actual session. So when we talk about the bang, we're talking about the bang is when something bad happens. And each side of that bang, and the room's not big enough to see what either end of the bang is. But if we think about the bang being something bad before something bad happens, and something after the bang has happened, something bad has happened. So in this case, from a data perspective, we could say remediation is one side, and we can say prevention is the other. I've done that the wrong way around. But ultimately, how do we prevent bad things from happening? Well, that again goes back to how do we develop more secure code that doesn't have the vulnerabilities that we don't even know about yet. So we can only put our best foot forward there from a development point of view. Equally, we need to make sure that the doors are locked so that people can't get into our network, etc. But equally, on the right-hand side is, okay, how do we ensure that if we do have something bad that's going to happen, and that could be a cyber threat, that could be ransomware, that could be, oh, I made a mistake and I deleted or dropped a database, and I'll get into that a little bit more later as well. But bad things could be literally anything. Could be any of those. It could be you're on the front page of a newspaper because you're down, but equally it could be I've accidentally misconfigured a database and dropped a table or dropped a whole database. Maybe we've been there, hopefully not. But bad things have happened. So just to introduce what that mission critical app is, and this was why that disclaimer was there. So I'm using a fork of an open source project around Pacman. Please don't send legal my way. And I'm just using someone else's Git repository, so it's fine, right? And I'm just talking about it. But if we look at that application stack, and just let me build the picture up here, is that I'm a company that is offering Pacman as a service, and with that, I just take off-the-shelf software from a vendor that has developed this software, and I trust that they've put all of the security in place. They're doing all of the security scanning, vulnerability scanning, they're updating CVEs, etc., so that when it comes to me and I update that, I'm in the best possible secure state. Now, that's a message to any devs in the room. We do our best, but equally, if you're taking off-the-shelf software, you probably can't put all the trust in that basket because you're relying on a moving target. Like CVEs, developers find out at the same time as everyone else. And then it's about rushing to patch that and being open and honest. So back to the application stack. So Pacman, Node.js front end, pretty basic stuff. And then a MongoDB backend where we're going to store those mission critical high scores and the usernames that we have. We're going to run it in Kubernetes because Kubernetes is cool. Really, it can run anywhere. So as I mentioned, you got the supplier of Pacman, where you saw that GitHub repo. We're going to download it from there. And Conference Games is going to use Helm to deploy that into our cluster. And we're just going to trust that it's going to be nice and secure and we can run that. The default configurations are safe enough. We're not going to expose anything. And we're Conference Games. We're hosting Pacman as a service. So if we think about the state of the game, so as an end user, exactly what I just mentioned, we've bought the software. We're now hosting that software as an MSP or managed service provider, and people are happily consuming our SaaS-based version of Pacman, and everyone's having fun and notching up those high scores in that database. Not that anyone needs to know what that back-end database is. And that software development lifecycle is obviously key. We're putting a lot of trust into that vendor to ensure that when that comes through that CI pipeline and we get into the continuous deployment, potentially, or just the deployment of that software, it's secure, it's safe. We put a lot of trust in that. And again, depending on where you are in the room, if you're a developer, if you're operational, if you're a DevOps engineer stuck in the middle, then all this will affect you as well. Okay, so what can bad look like? And this might be that we leave the door open and access management isn't configured correctly. It's pretty wild, actually, when we think about access. I'm going to touch on that next. Also, from a database point of view, with that Helm chart, I'm also deploying the database. I don't speak to many customers that would rely on a default database deployment, either be in Kubernetes, in a PaaS-based system, or in a virtual machine. a lot of application owners are going to want to roll their own database and cluster that accordingly and tweak that for the performance. They're not going to take an off-the-shelf version of that. However, that's what we've done here. And an attack can be focused on that database as well. One of the things that we're seeing in the cybersecurity space is a lot of data exfiltration. You know, a database is a really good structured way of lifting a flat file and almost zipping that up, compressing that, and getting that out of a business. And then suddenly I've got a whole database full of data if I can gain access to that. And then also backups. Backups tend to be the last line of defense when bad things happen. Backups are no good if that exfiltration situation happens, but equally they're going to get us out of a problem if if mistakes are made, if ransomware, something encrypts, the bad type of encryption encrypts our data as well. Just to go into access and kind of raise awareness of this, like ransomware is pretty difficult. People have moved on. There's actually companies that are providing ransomware as a service, like you could pay to be malicious against a corporation, and they have HR, they have finance, they have pay slips. Like you could go and work for a ransomware company. Hopefully no one in the room is doing that, but equally you could. Even more scarier to that is that disgruntled employees are going to the dark web and they're posting access keys or access credentials into businesses, and you could buy them for as little as £300, $300. If you go onto Reddit, there's even some on there that you can go and find. I was trying to find one as we were out there. I didn't have any signal, so I couldn't. But now I can basically go, right, well, what industry am I targeting? What's my budget? And I can start to really hone in on causing mayhem in particular areas. And that could be, I just want a remote desktop. I just want an SSH key. Like all of that. And it's wild to think. And everyone thinks this won't happen to me. But we see it every day in the news, especially the tech news. Big companies are being attacked. So we have to be mindful of that because it's going to happen. It's inevitable that it's just a matter of when. Also, biggest challenge that I'll give everyone today is go and stand up a public-facing database, maybe a MongoDB, but Postgres is just as impactful. I created a honeypot, and within 3 minutes on RDS, I had this little ransomware note to say, you left that port open with the defaults. And this is basically honing in on default configuration. You can't trust the defaults because defaults have vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities, be it the access management is very loose. Let's put it that way, and that could be so it's not secured. It could be public accessible, especially if you're putting that into a stateful set within Kubernetes. So, spoiler alert on that Pacman, the Helm chart. If you deploy that Pacman Helm chart to an EKS cluster, for example, that's going to open up an ELB to both your MongoDB as well as your Node.js front end. That's not the great way so we've built this Pacman to serve a purpose. Probably don't harden it. If you're going to go and play it, harden it before you play around with it. But misconfigurations, default configurations, access management, all of them all lead to potentially bad things. You might be lucky. 9 times out of 10, though, you're not going to be that lucky. Encryption, so you should encrypt your data because if you don't, someone else will, and that is what happens here. Now I don't have access to my super mission critical high scores. Just to touch on backups, like we all have backups, don't we? Does everyone have backups of personal data, corporate data, the most important stuff that we have within our business? Yeah, everyone's nodding, cool. But like I mentioned, ransomware encryption. So a bad actor gets into that system, they start encrypting that data, and now how do I get out? I either pay the ransom and trust these bad actors that they're going to decrypt that. Do they even have the right keys for that? Or do I have a backup and I can just roll back to where my last known good configuration? Equally, accidental deletion, corruption of that data. that might not be even a malicious user. That might just happen. Databases, structured, unstructured data, semi-structured data, it can corrupt. Storage systems, they can corrupt. Less and less, but it happens. Just accidents. We all make mistakes. We're humans. Mistakes were made. Misconfigurations is very easy, actually, to go. How many, in fact, I think at the end, dropping databases. Who's not dropped a database? Or who's dropped the wrong database? I know I've used Tmux, and I've flipped between the wrong console, and I've dropped a production database before. I think it's a rite of passage. Equally, natural disasters. We're very lucky in the UK. We don't tend to have natural disasters per se, but they're getting more frequent, at least from a flooding perspective. And just general power outages. If we're relying on a co-location of our data center, we're relying on a third party to provide us with power and cooling, and that could lead to outages. Conscious of time, I just wanted to kick off this demo. So this is the Pacman as a service. So here's Pacman, and I would have done this live, but timing was difficult. So I'm going to notch up a high score. You'll see that there is already a score in there. Again, this is recorded for KubeCon, so forgive that. I would have created a new one given time. So mission critical data. Everyone's got mission critical data. This is stored in that MongoDB and exposed through that MongoDB. Again, I'll just quickly show you. This is what it looks like in my collection within MongoDB. This is running inside of the Kubernetes cluster as a stateful set. Might be using an operator. I think it is just a stateful set. Yep, hopefully that makes sense. So we have our front end, you saw, with some mission critical data that is stored in a database, a very simple application. Probably doesn't need the complexity of Kubernetes. However, we could scale up. If we were in the room and we were all playing Pacman, I could use the power of Kubernetes to dynamically spin that up. Now, like I mentioned, is we made some mistakes. We used the defaults. So you can see here that I have my database. My Node.js has a forward-facing load balancer, public IP, but so does my database. So I've made a backup. I'm not going to talk about this. This is the product that we have. This is just a way to back that up. And so I'm taking a backup of that as the backup admin. And if I had a hoodie, I'd put that on in a second because I'm going to run that script. Just conscious of time.
You've got 7 minutes.
Oh, sweet. We'll easily finish this demo. So I'm just quickly running through a backup. And that's a backup within Kubernetes that is focused on the whole application. So that is the YAML manifests that make up that application as well as that database. So the PVC, but equally we're going to dive into that PVC, into that MongoDB pod, and we're going to make sure that the backup is consistent to that. So this is what we call, this is Canister. Canister is that open source project that I mentioned. That's diving inside of my MongoDB. It's saying, Mongo, I want to take a backup, pause IO, so that I can take a consistent copy of that, so that when I come to recover it, I have a consistent copy to bring back into either the same cluster or a different. I'm backing that up to an S3 bucket. This could be any compatible storage. And yeah, these are the files that make up that backup. So we first take a backup. That's a snapshot locally within the Kubernetes using the CSI volume snapshot class. And then we're going to export that snapshot out to S3 or any location profile. I mentioned around SDLC and us relying on that software vendor that they're going to be all nice and secure. So I'm going to run Trivy against that, another open source project. This was where Anais was. She was at Aqua. And this is going to tell us about any vulnerabilities that might be within that. Equally, from an infrastructure point of view, I'm going to run Trivy against my Terraform that built that Kubernetes cluster. And you'll start to see here, I just hit YOLO. I took some Terraform code off the internet, and I just hit run in my own AWS. Bad times, and that's why we see bad things happening. Again, defaults, or just taking code off the internet, or potentially, maybe I should have mentioned AI in 2025. Just using AI to develop and bring a Terraform bit of code to spin up an infrastructure is a bad idea without knowing what it actually does. So we've run Trivy. We're happy, or not so happy, but we know where we've got to go and fix. So a good nod that just because it's off-the-shelf software, probably don't put all your trust in that software vendor. Okay, so the export is now happening. And just finishing off the monitoring action so that we've got that. Again, I'm not really bothered about telling you about the backup software, even though they pay me to talk. Okay, so we've got our high scores. We've got our application. We know where the pitfalls are. We know where the misconfiguration is with the infrastructure. So now picture me in a hoodie doing bad things to our application, like misconfigurations. Everything's open. We can use defaults to get into it. So hoodie's gone on. So now we've gained access. We've bought access from Reddit, and we're now inside and we're going to use this script. And this script is going to, firstly, it's going to attack our database. So you see here, bad things have happened. I've got your data. I've corrupted or encrypted the data per se. Basically, if I had access to the database, I'm just going to drop it. But it doesn't have the same effect. Then I'm going to run another script that goes actually to my S3. So we're seeing a load of malicious actors actually target the backup infrastructure, because then that last line of defense is no longer available. So they want to get rid of it. They want to delete the bucket. And the great thing around S3 or S3 compatible storage, and actually Azure Blob has this, and even Google Cloud Storage have this as well, is that they have immutability built in. And what immutability does is it enables us to make sure that not even an AWS admin or a storage admin can delete that file, those folders, etc. So they're immutable. So we're storing that there. Now I've gone back into our custom product, and I'm just going to hit restore. So it looked like the S3 bucket was emptied using that script, if you were able to see that. Now I'm choosing, okay, what do you want to do from a recovery point of view? So hoodie's back, and now the admin who has to fix this after he's done the international sign of SOS and running around with his arms up. I'm now going to start recovering from the last known good backup that I had out there in that S3 bucket. Now, luckily, I have configured my S3 bucket with object lock, so we can show versions. I've got that folder. Luckily, my backups are good. And there is no way that either myself as an admin or AWS even, if you've used that object lock API and you've turned versioning on that bucket, there is no one that can manipulate that. They can't change that. They can't turn it off. Even if you cancel your account, that is locked for however long that's locked for, meaning that it's safe from attackers. Now, don't get me wrong, like the longer form session goes into exfiltration and how we incident response that. I'm not going to get into that too much here. So the recovery basically goes, okay, you want the whole application. You can go through and be granular about what that looks like. I'm going to choose the PVCs, the deployment, the stateful sets, etc. Bring everything back. So what we're seeing here is that process is starting to kick off, and hopefully you'll start to see a Pacman pod come up, then a MongoDB pod, some PVCs, etc. And then we're going to start, hopefully, we'll see those two mission critical high scores back in business after a bad thing that's happened. The bang has happened. The bang has come in. He's made, or she, they've made an impact on the business. So just waiting for these two pods to come up. And when we were at Rejects, I did this live. I actually did have a hoodie on, and it was, I guess there was a bit more tense there, because the spoiler alert is that this is a video. I know this works. I know our Pacman is going to be back. And there we go, refresh that. Like, pretty simple stuff, but hopefully, like, that's a fun little demo. But ultimately, like, if everyone can go back to their business, be it a developer, operations, DevOps, IT manager, whatever your role is, and be just a little bit more aware of data protection and what backups play a massive part, it'll be a huge thing when bad things happen. Like, it's not all bad. Like, it doesn't have to be all bad when we look at things like access management, database configuration, etc. There's just a lot of things to consider, and backups normally bottom of the list. It's pretty boring. Final resources, I'll share these. Like that final bit in red, backups are extremely boring. I've been working for Veeam for 10 years talking about backups. It's pretty boring. But outcomes, when bad things do happen, is where it's really, really important. It's a bit like our insurance. We all need insurance, but when bad things happen, we need that insurance, right? So yeah, with that, I'll be around for any questions, but yeah, hopefully that was useful. Hopefully that enables the raising awareness. You can find me all over the place. Yeah, thank you for coming. Cheers.